Welcome. Today we're going to talk about how best to support our kids' mental health during this back to school period. I would like to thank Scotiabank for supporting this initiative. I'm Chantal Valran, I'm the Executive Director of Drug Free Kids Canada. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Abby Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is a member of our advisory committee here at Drug Free Kids. She's a clinical psychologist who specializes in addictive behavior among adolescents. Dr. Goldstein is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and the Canada Research Chair in Psychology of Emerging Adulthood. Hello, Dr. Goldstein.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
So Drug Free Kids encourages parents and young people to have ongoing dialogue without any form of judgment about substance use. We want to help kids make healthy lifestyle decisions and reduce the risk associated with alcohol use, cannabis, and other substances. So as I mentioned earlier, tonight we're going to be discussing the links between mental health and substance use. We know that the back to school weeks can be stressful. It's a stressful time for children. It's a stressful time for everyone in the family, really. And with many of us struggling from COVID fatigue, this year's back to school can be particularly challenging. So how do we recognize risk factors that may lead to problematic use? And how do we promote a protective factor? Tonight, we're going to be spending a little bit of time on that with Dr. Goldstein. And following the webinar, we will be sending you a PDF that has the 10 key protective parenting strategies that we're going to be talking about. So we will follow up and you will have all of the information of mostly what we talked about tonight. So let me start with the first question. As I previously mentioned, many of us are feeling COVID fatigue. We're just coming out slowly, recuperating from that weird period that was those 2 years. Dr. Goldstein, can you tell us about the impact this fatigue can have on families? And then as a sub-question, we can talk about the connection between mental health and substance use, but let's talk about specifically COVID fatigue and how that can impact families.
Sure. Well, I think it's really important to note that COVID has really magnified many of the mental health challenges that children and youth were already experiencing. But there is also evidence that things have worsened, during the pandemic. And there was a really great report that came out from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health that they looked at children and in school in grades 7 to 12 in 2021. And they found that over half of the students said that they felt depressed about their future because of COVID-19. Over 1/3 felt that their mental health had been either very much or extremely negatively impacted by COVID. And unfortunately, about 1/4 felt that their relationship with their parents or guardians had worsened a bit or a lot during the pandemic. So I think that tells us a bit about what's happening with both teens and families during the pandemic. And so I think really kind of the whole unit, the whole family unit really has been struggling during this time. With parents, they were balancing their job stress with the demands of parenting kids and helping kids do school online. And I think one of the biggest disruptions occurred to routines. I think families really thrive in the context of routines, and that provides structure for kids and parents. And it's something we know is quite important for well-being, but it was very difficult for families to maintain consistent routines during COVID. I think this fall has really been about the opportunity to reestablish routines for many families. And so sort of the hope is that with that reestablishment, we're on course for improving some of the challenges that people were facing during COVID. I also just want to make one other point, which is that I think one of the things that people sort of don't think as much about is that COVID really disrupted opportunities for youth and kids to develop social and emotional skills. So much of that happens in school and with friends and things around social competence. So kids' abilities to sort of identify what to do and how to respond in a social situation and to sort of make the right choices in those situations. That's social competence. And it's such an important skill. It's actually something we know is helpful in preventing substance use. But kids just had fewer opportunities to practice those skills because so many social events were canceled. Sometimes they were in school, but they were really just in class. They didn't have the opportunities to really do things with friends outside of the classroom. So I think that's also a big piece of what's been disrupted as a result of COVID.
I personally have a 14 and a 16-year-old, and that 2 year gap, they went into their room. My son was 14, he came out 16, has, grown so much and different voice and different set of friends that we never actually even met because they interacted online. So that's an added layer of, I think, anxiety or stress as a kid to reintegrate a routine and a normal life. Although you've mentioned that routine is a good thing, and it's a good thing that we're reintegrating that into our lives. It can, I think, also bring a layer of stress because there's there haven't been, as you said, exposed to it, and having to also reintegrate into a routine of going to their sports and having to do school and coming back and taking the bus and doing homework. And so it can be particularly stressful. Coming back to my question, is there a connection between mental health and substance use? Is that something that should concern parents if their kids are extra stressed starting with school, that it could lead into problematic substance use, for example?
hmm I mean, we know that there is definitely a connection between mental health and substance use. I mean, if we look at the research, we can see that relationship exists for individuals, for youth who struggle with mental health concerns. Rates of substance use and problematic substance use are definitely higher. It's always hard to sort of tease apart kind of that chicken and egg phenomenon, kind of what came first. Is it that the mental health concern precedes the substance use, or substance use can lead to mental health concerns? We know for sure there is sort of what we call a dose response relationship, which is that for kids and teens, heavier, more frequent substance use certainly is associated with a greater likelihood of developing a mental health concern. But also, when we think about some of the motivations that teens may have for using substances, for example, social anxiety can be one of those motivations, right? If teens are feeling anxious in social situations and then they're at a party, sometimes they may turn to substances as a way to manage some of that anxiety or to fit in with what's happening in that social situation. And so, even there, we see in the situations that there can be that connection between something that's happening on that mental health level and choices around substance use.
Going back to this back to school context, and having, as I said, an appreciation that this back to school time may be slightly different from what we're used to. There's always this excitement about going into school, seeing who's going to be in your class, who's your teacher. But considering that we're reintegrating a routine that we're not used to, can you talk a bit to us about what kids may be worried about or stressing about, and the potential impact that they may be experiencing because of that stress or the concerns specifically at this time?
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's always hard to know, what all kids are going through. And I think it's so important that we ask kids and teens themselves as to what's on their minds as they navigate this transition. But I do think that, there are probably some common themes that emerge. And one of them is really around anxiety, right? I think that there's oftentimes anxiety about that transition back to school, what it's like to be with new people in new classes, with new teachers. Sometimes I think, part of what is a bit unique to COVID too is that now teens and kids have just spent a lot of time with their parents. So they've kind of been within the comfort of their homes with their parents for extended periods of time. And so there's some separation anxiety. And it may not be that they're sort of, really, really struggling with being apart from their parents, but they may feel it more than they normally would because they've had all this time with their parents during the pandemic. And I think the social anxiety piece is also, quite significant, right? COVID really created a lot of bubbles for kids. So even in school, kids were staying with their cohorts. They were having sort of lunch in their classrooms. And now they're kind of out into, at lunchtime, it's kind of a bit of a free for all. They're allowed to mix with other cohorts and kids of all ages. And for some kids, that may be very anxiety provoking. It may be sort of hard for them to find their friends, find the group of kids who they feel that they fit in with. And so I think that's created new anxieties that may not have necessarily been there pre-COVID. The other piece of anxiety is that we've just spent the last 2 years telling our kids and teens to be very cautious about their health, to wear masks and stay far apart from friends and don't spend time in large groups. And now they're back in school. There's not a masking requirement, and so now they may also have fears about, what if I bring COVID home to my family and I put my family at risk for contracting COVID. And so again, it's sort of a fear and a heightened sense of anxiety that we've never really experienced before.
I appreciate that you say as well, this is a good opportunity to ask your kids, how are they feeling? And because some of it we may think as well, we may project that they must be stressed about this, and it may not be that at all. So this is also a good opportunity to check in, see how they're doing. But also I think that, to be able to evaluate as a parent how stress can be normal at this time, and
Yes.
what is normal, like it's okay to feel like this. You can normalize the sentiments, but I guess that leads to my next question is, there's that normal transition. We're all feeling, as I said, after COVID fatigue and all of this, and there's impact, and recognizing this. But as a parent, is there a way for me to recognize where all of a sudden it may be going in a way that is not as regular, or that, if I were to put it into words that we talked about at the beginning, how do I recognize some risk factors that my kids may be struggling more than normal, and in a way could actually just be influenced to use substance use as a way to self-medicate? So risk factors, and to prevent problematic substance use as a regulation for them.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that first question that you asked about, sort of how do I know when kind of we've moved from the regular stress and anxiety that's likely to come with the beginning of school to being in a place where it's more than that, and we're sort of thinking maybe this is something that we need to really seek out some professional help, because it feels like things aren't settling down, or they're struggling more than kind of what's typical. And I think, there's a few things. I think one is sort of the length of time. I mean, I think that it's normal for the first few weeks of school to feel, stressful, and there to be some anxiety. But for most kids, that will fade. They will start to become more comfortable with the routine. They'll start to adjust to being in their classrooms, and they'll become more comfortable. If we see the opposite, that the anxiety is actually increasing, over time, that is a bit of a red flag. That suggests, okay, something's happening here that suggests that they're not necessarily adjusting in the way that we would expect. And so we may want to access resources to provide them with additional support. I think the other thing is, if it's really impacting their functioning, if they're not sleeping, or their appetite is lowered, or they're, much moodier than typical, or they really are, avoidant of school. They're sort of, adamant, I don't want to go. Those are also signs that things are extending outside of kind of what we would see as the just general stress and anxiety that a lot of kids and teens experience with the beginning of school. So I think as parents, it's really important to be on the lookout for those. And I think what you said before is really important. I mean, for the most part, we are likely to be seeing normal stress and anxiety. And as parents, we can validate that. We can say, I know this is a really stressful time. I know this is tough being back in school, and recognize that those feelings are very normal and natural, while also helping our kids problem solve a little bit. Like, so, what can you do at lunch that will help you so that you don't feel like you're wandering around and not being able to find anybody? Or, is there something you can bring from home with you to school so that it feels like there's a little bit of comfort from home? So I think that kind of normalizing and validating plus problem solving can be a really helpful strategy for kids. All of these things, again, when we look back at that mental health substance use connection, that risk factor is certainly there. So when we think about, when kids are experiencing anxiety, depression, or if they're experiencing what we call externalizing disorders, which are things like conduct disorder, where there may be sort of more acting out, those things are certainly related to a higher likelihood of substance use. And I think part of that is also what we would call difficulties with emotion regulation. So when kids have trouble coping with difficult emotions, so when, for example, they may go from like 0 to 100 very quickly, or they have trouble shifting out of a challenging emotion, or difficulty sort of controlling their impulses when they're feeling really stressed, those are also tend to be risk factors for engaging in substance use. So I think those are things that we really want to be thinking about as, where we may be concerned about that link between what they're going through with respect to that stress and anxiety and a risk factor for substance use.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is, looking at this point in time anyways, the length of time that they're feeling anxious, the amplitude of how they're feeling, looking at particular changes that all of a sudden may be out of character, emotion regulations, and one of the tip that you were given is, acknowledging that you're what you're seeing as a parent, and maybe help them problem solve and on how to make them feel better. Does that sound like I took good notes? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
That's good. But so because my question is as well, it's one thing to feel it now, but parents were hoping to have tools that, in January, for example, if all of a sudden they're feeling that their kids are somewhere off. And sometimes we hear it's normal, that any teenagers with the hormonal changes and everything, they already are dealing with emotional, like having difficulty doing this whole regulation around emotions. They go from one to
Yes.
like, so when do we know that there's the normal teenage stuff that's happening, and all of a sudden I should be paying more attention? How do I best support my kid in this situation? Is there an
Yeah.
easy answer for that?
There's definitely not an easy answer, but I think one of it is also like trusting your instincts as a parent is, that goes a long way in recognizing that your child, your teen, you have a sense of when sort of things seem very different from where they were at a previous point. I mean, I think one of the things we oftentimes talk about when we're thinking about how do I sort of identify that my child may be struggling with a mental health or a substance use concern is really about changes. Is there a point at which we see a really significant change in their behavior? For example, they're spending a lot more time in their room. They seem to be disconnected from friends who they were previously connected with. They're sort of refusing to engage with you and your family, even though that was something that they had done in the past. Those kinds of things, when we see things that are very different behaviors, those are oftentimes red flags for, yeah, we need to do a little bit more investigating, asking, some more questions to them, really opening those lines of communication to make sure we're getting a good sense of what's happening with them, and then sort of accessing support if we feel like that's an important next step.
I think it all goes back again to making sure this dialogue is going on, and being able to check in, being able to say, I'm witnessing this, feels off. How are you? How are you feeling? Am I completely crazy here when I'm seeing these things and feeling these things that you may be feeling? So validating this, and being able to go to your kid and validate it with your kid, is definitely a good advice. So thank you for sharing your insight on risk factors. On the other side of things, is there anything parents can do to help develop protective factors or consolidate protective factors? Or, in a more popular way, we're hearing a lot about resilience right now. Is there something that we can do to help young people develop resilience as a parent?
Yeah. Well, and the good news is there's a lot that parents can do to help their kids develop resilience. So I think it's always important to know that as parents, we play a big role with regards to how our kids and teens manage situations and sort of, how we can help them make healthy decisions. One really important protective factor that comes from parents is something called parental monitoring, which is sort of the idea that you know what your kids are doing, who they're with, and where they are, at times where it's unstructured time or at times when they're not with you. And also that you're setting clear expectations around, the activities that they're involved in, and having fairly, as you already mentioned, Chantal, fairly regular check-ins with them about sort of where they're at, and check-ins about your expectations and how those things are being met. So I think there's many different ways that we can make sure those things are happening as parents. So one of them is just, again, doing those check-ins. Asking those questions. Oh, before you go out, please make sure to let me know where you're going and who you're going with, and also what time you're going to be home. So being very clear that that's the expectation around what's going to happen when they leave the house. And also setting clear expectations about their behavior. So I think, when we think about, for example, setting limits with our kids, sometimes that's not an easy thing to do. But it certainly is reasonable. It's important that parents set expectations with their kids about drinking or cannabis or other substance use, and to set very clear limits about what they feel is reasonable in those areas, and discuss what would be the consequences if those expectations are violated. I think one thing that's really important to know is that it's a lot easier to have more rules in place and slowly remove them as you begin to develop more trust with your teen about making good decisions than it is to have no rules in place and then try to implement them later on. It's also just in terms of setting expectations. I think this is also a hard thing to do because sometimes parents feel like, it's not realistic for me to tell my teen that, they should never drink because they may be very well in situations where there is some experimenting, for example, with alcohol. And so is that a realistic thing for me to say to them? But I think you can still set an expectation with your kids that that's not what you want for them, that, you don't want them to be drinking at a young age. You don't want them to be drinking before they're, legally allowed to drink, but also let them know that, your goal for them is to be making good and healthy decisions. And that if they do end up in a situation where they may have been drinking or using cannabis, or others around them may be involved with those things, that they can still count on you. You want them to, know that you don't want them to engage in those behaviors, but if anything happens, if they're with their friends and something goes wrong, that they can still come to you, because that's a really important thing for them to feel comfortable with.
Thank you. Setting expectations is such an important key, so that they can act accordingly. Monitoring the behavior. Monitoring can sound like a negative thing to do, but it's just it's a matter of caring and taking time to know where your kids are, and knowing that, letting them know that you do care and it does matter. We also like to tell parents that, we have a campaign running right now that just says, keep talking. When you have teenagers, you may be thinking that, there's no point, they're not listening to me, they don't care. We do a tracking study every year, and we poll 1,000 parents and 1,000 kids across Canada and ask them different questions about behavior and attitudes regarding substance use and general mental health questions. And one of the questions is to kids, what's your most reliable source of information when it comes to substance use? And surprisingly, 63% say parents. It comes at the same level as school. They'll trust what the school is going to tell them about substance use. They'll trust their parents. They'll trust their parents in school before their friends and before social media. The key here is reliable source of information, right? So they do know that you care. They do know that, you're coming from a place of love, and you want to just engage in a conversation so they can make healthy decisions. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you're not going to be there at that party when they get offered those substances, and you want them to make, the best choices for them, the healthiest and safest choices for them. So having those conversations before, setting expectations before, being able to educate yourself as a parent, but as well as sharing that education with your kid, I think is truly vital. Can we talk about talking actually? Can we so it's one thing to, okay, so I know the risk factors and I know what I should be doing as a parent to promote resilience and healthy decision making. How do I go about initiating that conversation? How do I establish that dialogue with my kid? Do you have any suggestions for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways that can happen. I think, one really good opportunity is what I would call teachable moments. So, when something sort of happens either in the media or to one of their friends, or even when we thought about the sort of legalization of cannabis in Canada, there was so much on the news about cannabis and effects on teens. And those are really good opportunities to then open the conversation, right? Sort of to follow up on what you're hearing on the radio or in the news and say, hey, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts on all of these cannabis stores opening up in our neighborhood? Or, you hear about a friend or somebody else's experience with alcohol and ask your teen, have you ever been in that situation where somebody's offered you alcohol? Or, have you ever had that happen where you're at a party and other people are drinking? So sort of really just using those things that are naturally happening in their environment as a springboard to be able to have open conversations. And really approaching those conversations with sort of, without judgment, with curiosity. I mean, you're really interested in understanding their perspective. And with sort of collaboration and opportunity, I think, Chantal, you already said that parents are an important source of information. Kids and teens also have a lot of information to start with, and you may be sort of co-discovering things. The idea that if we don't know something, why don't we look together? Let's sort of see if we can find out a little bit more about this topic. I mean, your kids may have some ideas about, for example, cannabis effects on health. And you may say, to be honest, I don't know that much about that. Let's have a look. I'm sure we can find some information together on what that's about. So sort of really just coming from that lens of curiosity and non-judgment, and making sure that the door is always open for those conversations to happen. Because sometimes you'll open the conversation and your kids will sort of shrug it off. They're not that interested in talking. But you want to make sure they know that, even if they're not that interested in talking, you can say, all right, well, let's put it aside for now, but just know I'm always happy to have this conversation if you want to come back to it later. So making sure that it feels like that door is always open for them to talk to you.
Well, exactly. That's the whole thing about the keep talking that I was saying, right? So they may not be looking like they're interested or that they're listening, but they are. That's one thing. And then the other thing too is I think it's okay to check in with your kid and say, "This is really important to me. I'd really like to be able to talk to you about this. Maybe this is not a good time." Like being respectful of their time, but saying, "I want us to circle back. So I'm going to get back to you, tomorrow or the day after. We'll set aside some time and we'll talk about it again. I respect the fact that you may not want to be talking about it right now, but like as a parent, I think that we need to keep at it and be persistent and but give them room, but at the same time uh, being able to say, but we'll revisit, we'll recircle. And one other point that I also wanted to make is that whole thing about let's search together, right? So some parents may be intimidated saying, I don't use or I use, and I don't want to initiate a conversation because I'm afraid of what that's going to come. So that's another thing. But parents are saying, I don't have all the information. I don't really know what to say. So I don't want to be ambushed. Therefore, I'm not going to initiate conversation. Mm-hmm. I think that's showing that you may not have all the answers, or that maybe you didn't make the right decisions at some point. Allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of your kids is giving them the permission to be vulnerable at the same time. So it's also giving them the permission to not always make the right decision, but know that they can always come to you and you can always talk about it. So being able to bring that authenticity to the dialogue and say, I'm not perfect. I may not have always made the right decision. I may not have the answers, but it's important that we talk about this. So I think that's another way of approaching. And, you know, maybe I tricked the question when I said, how do we initiate the dialogue? Um, Ideally, it's how do I keep the conversation going, right? So yes, breaking the ice, but steering clear of having the talk, right? Like it's not a matter of saying, I've talked about this, I did all of my speaking points, I got it off my list, we never need to talk about it again. I wouldn't advise that that's the way to go. I think that you have to keep an ongoing dialogue. It can be very trivial sometimes, but it can be very emotional at once. But as I mentioned, you build a foundation so that they know they can come back to you. A lot of our talk tonight revolves around prevention, education. How do we equip our kids to make good decisions, healthy decisions? But what about if, I know that my kid has either tried it already or is using on a regular basis, but I haven't approached the subject with them. Is it too late? What do I do as a parent? How do I then, go towards my kid and share how I'm feeling about this?
Yeah. And again, absolutely, definitely not too late. It's never too late. I mean, parents have such an important role to play in supporting their kids and helping, provide them with guidance throughout their lives. I think in some ways, it's certainly, I think there's a few things. I think one is as a parent, sometimes it's helpful to sort of manage your own emotional response a little bit to that, right? Because I think the initial response is to feel angry or disappointed. And if that's what comes out right away, it's very likely to stop a conversation from happening very quickly, because the response to anger for any teen is likely to be defensiveness. And the conversation will, deteriorate pretty quickly. So I think once you've done that, once you sort of have the opportunity to sort of, have it sit with you a little bit, to use this as an opportunity to be able to talk about what's happening with your child. So to even be able to approach them about that, whether it's that they came home from a night of, drinking, for example, and that they're intoxicated. In some ways, sometimes what happens is there's a consequence in and of itself of that experience if they're, not feeling well, or they know that, and there's sort of some of the embarrassment that comes with that. But then making sure you do sit down and have that open conversation with them the next day and say, I noticed you came home last night and you were intoxicated. And again, starting, we talk a lot about open-ended questions like, tell me a little bit about what happened, or tell me a bit about what went on at the party. And then, I think you want to have those conversations. Again, it goes back to, you may have very well set that expectation that you don't want your kids drinking, but you also need to be realistic about where your kid is at, and the things that they may already be doing or not doing. And then it sort of comes back to making healthy decisions to reduce risks, as much as possible, to ensure their well-being and promote their safety. So if you already know that that's happening, you may talk to them about, I think it's important that we have a conversation about your, being careful and making, the best decisions possible, even in those really difficult situations. How would you limit your drinking if you were going out with friends and you felt like everyone was drinking around you? And even if you wanted to have one drink, what would you do so that you weren't, drinking too much? And again, or what would you do if you weren't feeling well and you needed to get some help? So I think you do want to play through some of those scenarios that realistically address what may be happening currently in your teen's life. I think you don't want to bury your head in the sand and pretend that all is okay if that's not what's happening. And I think you also want to be alert to the fact of, sometimes in some situations, you may feel like you need to bring in a professional to help you with managing that too. So, again, if you're noticing that there are major changes with your teen, and you also are noticing that they're more involved with substance use, then that may be a point at which you are helping them find support so that they can talk to a professional. That may be for you going to your family doctor and asking who you can talk to, or using resources from Drug Free Kids, which I know that there's a lot of resources available with DFK around how do we talk to kids and how can we access supports.
Yes, thank you for referring to our to our resources. A follow up to that. So if I know that my kid is using and I want to approach the conversation, and I've alluded to that in another question, what about if I'm using myself?
Hmm.
And some parents may shy away from having the conversation because they may feel it's hypocritical, or I'm telling you to do something that I'm already doing myself. So how do I approach a conversation about substance use if I'm what would be some advice that you would give to a parent who was using but want to engage in that conversation with their kids?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a few things, and it actually also goes back a little bit to that kind of protective factors perspective, which is just we didn't talk about the importance of modeling. So, kind of that, parents modeling different behaviors obviously has a big impact on kids. Kids pick up a lot what their parents are doing. So, for example, when we think about using alcohol or cannabis to cope, if kids see their parents using alcohol or cannabis for those reasons, then they may feel like, oh, well, that's sort of the best coping tool at my disposal. So I'm going to go to that too if I'm feeling stressed or anxious. And so I think one thing is about managing that for your own self. If, for example, you're drinking or using cannabis, to not make that something that is about coping with stress or tension. So kind of really not modeling that for your kids, that's your kind of go-to coping mechanism, and instead talking about other coping strategies and modeling your use of other coping strategies, where sort of parents coping is going to play a big role in what their kids pick up regarding their coping. I think, in terms of talking about your own substance use, I think you kind of want to think about your own child and what it's like, how likely it is they are to use that information in a way that's going to be helpful for them. But I think you can also use it as an opportunity to share something with your child that helps them in their own decision making. So you may talk about, yes, I know that I have a drink on the weekends, or I use cannabis on the weekends. I know for my own self that was something that I really only started after I was of legal age. And I do it because it's something that I enjoy, but I want to make sure that for you, that it's not something that is, you want to use to help cope with difficult emotions or challenging emotions. And I think, again, you can talk to them about how you recognize what your limits are and how you've been able to make healthy and responsible decisions, leading up to this point. Again, I think it's difficult because kids do certainly pick up on things. So they're going to pick up on it if you're using substances. But I think you want to be able to have that open conversation with them about sort of what that means for them, and go back to, what are the approaches that they can use so that they're still able to make healthy decisions in terms of their own substance use.
Thank you. So encouraging healthy decision making, right? So ultimately is coaching them in a way that they're going to make healthy decisions for themselves.
Yes.
I think that we could go now into the Q&A section. We already have received a question that maybe we can start there, and I'll invite the other attendees today, if you have any questions, to go and post them. I also have other ones, but let's start with this one. So it's saying, what is the youngest age or earliest grade that you're starting to see kids using / becoming addicted?
Mhm. So I mean, I think that in terms of age, I mentioned that the Ontario Student Drug Use Health Survey, which is a survey of grades 7 through 12, and rates of use are still quite low in grade 7. So the average age for initiation for cannabis, I believe, is around. I think it's around 14. So there's definitely, it's still really the teens where we're seeing that's the age at which most teens and kids are initiating substance use. We don't tend to see kids and teens using substances much younger than 12 or 13, for example. In terms of addiction, I mean, it definitely is, a continuum in terms of experimenting with substances, versus moving to the point at which it becomes something that is more problematic. And so again, oftentimes when we think about addictions developing, it is really a very small percentage of the teen population who experiment with substances who develop an addiction, but that doesn't mean they may not experience problems associated with their substance use. So even, for example, binge drinking, which is a kind of common way that teens drink, which is when they drink, 4 or 5 drinks in one sitting. That may not be something they do all the time, but the times that they do it, they may find that they're experiencing consequences. They may find they don't feel well the next day. They may find they make bad decisions under the influence of alcohol. They may find they do things that feel embarrassed about or regret the next day. And so it may not be that they necessarily have an addiction, but they're still experiencing consequences associated with their substance use. And that can happen really kind of at any age after which the person has started using or experimenting with substances. All that to say, though, just one other thing, that it's even though we know that usually it is sort of around middle school where there is the initiation of substance use when kids first try substances, it doesn't mean that we can't have those conversations earlier than that. So we can start having conversations with kids well before the time at which they're likely to start using substances, because we want to make sure that they're well prepared by the time they get to those years to be able to manage the situations where they may be facing decisions around alcohol or cannabis use.
Thank you. I wouldn't have said that better, because as we said, it's not waiting until we're faced with the situation or in a state of very high emotions because we're realizing that our kid has already experimented and now you don't really know. So if you've set the foundation before you've extracted the emotions from it, it becomes easier after. So definitely. And it, as you've mentioned, if the average experimental age of cannabis is at 14, that's why it's important to have set that foundation way before then. But as also you said, it's never too late. So I encourage parents of all ages tonight to engage in those conversations. We don't have any more question on the Q&A, but we have one that comes up on every webinar. And particularly now, as we're mentioning in this post-COVID or more relaxed COVID situation, now that the sanitary measures are more relaxed, some parents are saying that their kids now are invited to parties where it wasn't happening. And as we've said before, some of these kids, unfortunately, were, stuck in their room or stuck at home for 2 years, and now, boom, they're invited to parties where they may be exposed to alcohol or cannabis. What could we do as parents to help kids make safe and healthy decisions for themselves and avoid peer pressure in a situation where there really wasn't any gradual way of being introduced to alcohol? They went from, nothing, no parties at all, to all of a sudden there's parties and there's substances around. So what advice would you have for parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely tricky because in some ways, going to a party can foster, again, healthy things for kids. It helps with developing independence and confidence in social situations, and they can start to feel more responsible. So we don't want to sort of shelter them from all of the things that we know are developmentally normal for them to experience. But it is also the kind of culture, party culture is the culture that promotes substance use, right? Alcohol and cannabis use typically for teens happens within parties. That's where it's most likely that they're going to be offered those things and have to deal with what they're going to do in those situations. And so I think a few things. One, the more, again, if we think about that starting early with kids, the more confident our kids are in their ability to assert themselves, the more social competence they have, the more likely they are to be able to manage those situations effectively. We're not going to be able to, avoid peer pressure altogether. They're definitely going to have to deal with situations where they feel like friends are pressuring them into doing something, and then make decisions about how they're going to, behave in those situations. And so we as parents can help prepare them for that, recognizing the high likelihood that it's going to happen by helping to boost their confidence, helping to, early on remind them about asserting them, their own rights and their needs in different situations, be proactive about sort of, things that they want for themselves. And then if we know they're going to parties, I think it's important to set parameters around that and to, slowly build up trust for them. So it may be that, we at the first party, we say, you can go as long as parents are there. I'd like to speak to those parents before the party happens, so I have a sense of what's going to happen there. And then plan ahead with them, ask them, so here are a few scenarios. What will you do if? So what will you do if the person you were supposed to go home with decides that they're not ready to go home at 11 o'clock and that's your curfew time? Or what will you do if the people you came with are all drinking too much and, they're not in a position to be able to really sort of make good decisions anymore? And it's also helpful to have some check-in points. So again, this is about building trust. So you may decide, an hour into the party, I want to text you and see how you're doing, and my expectation is that you're going to text me back so we can have that check-in and I can make sure everything's going okay, and set those things up ahead of time so that there are ways to build trust. And then again, it's about that sort of slowly releasing some of those rules as trust is built. So it may be that the next party they can stay out a little bit later. You don't necessarily insist that parents are there, and slowly building up to a point where you feel that they're gaining more and more responsibility.
Thank you. We have another question. What is your opinion on having a safe space to party for your child, i.e., have alcohol allowed at your place opposed to having a bush party? So this question, coming from Mary, it's often asked in those webinars. So I'm glad, Mary, that you brought it up. So what would be your advice to the parents that are inclined to think, well, it's going to be safer because at least I'll be there to monitor?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of parents have that thought that, if it's in my house, if I know it's under my roof, then it's likely to be safer. But the truth is that allowing kids to drink under your roof or giving them alcohol so that they avoid getting it from somewhere else, the research shows that that doesn't actually protect them from experiencing harms associated with alcohol. So studies they've done research on this because it's such a common question. And the studies show that kids whose access to alcohol has come from parents or who are drinking in their parents' homes have the same risks for harmful drinking as kids whose access comes from other sources. And I think one thing that is important to know is that we do know that parental permissiveness, so the degree to which parents are sort of give permission to their kids to drink, is associated with more harms with drinking. And I think part of that is because with kids who feel that their parents are kind of okay with their drinking, then they feel like there's less concern about limiting their own drinking. So I think, the teen who knows that their parents are going to be upset with them if they come home intoxicated may, first of all, they have that as an excuse. They can say, well, I can't drink because if I go home and my parents smell alcohol on me, I'm going to get in trouble. So they sort of already have a built-in refusal skill that they can use in that situation. But they also know that themselves, even if they were going to have one or two drinks, they may feel like I have to stop there because I don't want to go home and be, and have had too much to drink because, my parents, I know that that's not what they think is okay. So I think that setting up those expectations with your kids is really a helpful way to help them limit their drinking too. And again, it helps with promoting some of that safe decision making.
So research is backing up the fact that, from what I'm hearing, allowing consumption at home is not an indicative of having better decision making around usage down the line. Interesting. Yep. Thank you, Mary, for the question. Another question that comes up often is, what do I do as a parent if I find alcohol or drugs in my kid's room? What do I do then?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that as we talked about with respect to if you know that your child has been using alcohol or cannabis or other drugs, that it is an opportunity. So, most parents who find alcohol or drugs in their child's room, oftentimes they're finding it because they may already suspect that there's something to find. So, sometimes it's because they're already kind of looking a little bit. They have an idea that perhaps there may be something there and that they're going to find something. Um, and I do think if you're sort of waiting to find evidence to start that conversation, then in some ways this is your chance to open up the conversation to them again without judgment. Sort of saying, I found this in your room, and I have to say I was a bit surprised and a bit concerned. What kind of what got it there, what was it doing there, and then I really think I'm going back to that question about motive. So tell me a bit about, like, what are some of your reasons that you're using alcohol or cannabis, and really listen to what they have to say. Again, I think it's always the instinct to sort of jump in with anger or disappointment or punishment, and when we do that, it just shuts the conversation down so quickly. That doesn't mean that we can't have, if you've had rules that I don't want alcohol or drugs in my house, and you find that your child is storing, alcohol or cannabis in their room, and they've broken that rule, then I think it's important to be consistent with setting that expectation and following through with whatever consequence had been discussed ahead of time. But I think you can do that even without being angry. I think you can say, we did have that agreement that you wouldn't bring alcohol into your room, and now I found this in your room, and so I am going to have to take away your phone for 2 weeks. Whatever it is, and that would be actually devastating, I know, but whatever the consequence has been and agreed upon. And that's where it goes back to having set that expectation way ahead of time, means that there's a lot more freedom to be able to talk openly about it when it happens, rather than sort of reacting to a situation.
And it also goes back to when we were talking before of checking in of, is this a good time? It's also a time for the parent to think, is this a good time for me to address this, right? So finding it and then taking the time to think how I'm going to approach this. What's the best way for me not to, lose my temper or be too emotional? How can I be more pragmatic about it? And then finding tools and, you rehearse for a job interview. So I'm not saying that have a script, but at least have an appreciation of, this is what I'm trying to convey and this is why I'm concerned about this. So being able to regulate your emotions, you were talking about, that's one of the key thing about resilience and helping our kids. So even as a parent, having a check-in with yourself and being able to say, when is the best time and what's the best approach for me to do this, so that it's going to be conducive to a rich dialogue. We are almost out of time. Maybe one last question, and you've mentioned it before, but I'd like to come back to it to make sure that we're there to help parents. When as a parent is it time for me to seek professional help to help my kid, to best support my kid?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it goes back to, really that parents have a really good understanding of their own kids, and they know typically when what they're seeing in their kids feels like something that is out of the ordinary for them. With substance use, we tend to see, again, very significant changes in kids when they're using substances regularly or they're clearly struggling with their substance use. So, they may be shutting down more often, spending more time in their room, as I said, sort of shutting out different people in their lives who they used to feel connected with, shutting us out as parents, sort of not that having that willingness to have conversations with us. And also, I mean, I think with kids, when they're using substances, there's lots of things that they're trying to do to cover that up. So I think when you're noticing that there's a lot of that happening also, that may be a red flag too. So you notice that they're, quickly walking by you. They don't want to make eye contact when they walk in the door. And that's regularly happening. I think those would be sort of signs that there's something that's happening for them and that it would be helpful to seek support. But sometimes I just say, if you even are wondering about it, the best thing to do is to do it, to talk, to have a conversation with your family doctor, to utilize the text resource through Drug Free Kids, to ask the questions of professionals. The worst thing that happens is that the professional meets with your teen and says, to be honest, I don't really see that there's an issue here. But sort of better that than not going forward and helping them access support and ending up in a position where they're suffering and struggling, and that support has not yet been accessed for them.
I think that's good advice. If you feel that you need to speak to a professional, there's no harm in reaching out. There's lots of resources for support to be able to do this. We have one more question that just came in. Maybe we won't have time to go for the 5, because we're asked, what are the top 5 reasons we can give our child not to use substances until it's legal, until they're of the legal age?
Yeah. It's such a good question, and I think we oftentimes are looking for those things. We're looking for reasons. I think the hard part is reasons that resonate with them. I mean, I think for us as parents, we can think of really good reasons, but they may not necessarily be that important to our teens, given sort of where they're at developmentally. I do think the piece around the fact that teens' brains are continuing to develop throughout their teen years and into adulthood, and that we know that substance use can have an impact on the developing brain, is an important one, because it's sort of, it's a very clear, tangible thing that we can link back to. There's a significant risk here. It's why we have a legal age for cannabis and alcohol use, and so I think it's really important to consider what this could do to your brain and how that could impact you over time. I think other pieces are around mental health, sort of recognizing that link between substance use and mental health, especially if you have a teen who's already struggling with anxiety or depression or other mental health issues, recognizing that using substances worsens the symptoms associated with those disorders. And I think just sort of some of the very real risks that happen, the risks associated with using substances in driving, the risks associated with having injuries associated with substance use, and the risks. I think for teens, sometimes there is sort of like that social piece of recognizing that sometimes when under the influence of substances, you may not make the decisions that you feel are really in your best interest, and it's really difficult to do that. Now, to be a young person with a still developing brain and under the influence of substances, it puts you in a position where you may be very vulnerable to making decisions that in the end are not decisions that you really want to be making for yourself. And so I want to protect you from those, decisions. And this is really one thing that would, be helpful, which is to, either not use substances at all, or being, making as healthy decisions as you can around your substance use.
Thank you very much. This it brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you for the attendees who have participated and asked questions and just stayed throughout the whole presentation. Thank you so much for your presence. Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for your expertise and your experience and your generosity tonight. It's much appreciated. I want to remind attendees that you will receive an email including a PDF with parenting strategies for building resilience. I also want to let you know that there's a lot of tools and resources that you can use and access through our website at Drug Free Kids Canada. There's also a chat line that we referred to tonight. If you have more questions or if you're seeking support or guidance on any of the topic that we covered tonight, or anything that you wanted to ask and didn't get a chance, we have a free chat on our website, as well as a direct line that you can access. When you leave the webinar tonight, there's a short survey. It's only going to take, I promise, a minute or two to fill in, but it's really going to be helpful for us to host other webinars and know how useful, if it was useful to you tonight. I sure hope so. So thank you, Dr. Goldstein, once again, and thank you for every parent or professional that assisted to the presentation tonight. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.